The sound of a cane striking dusty boards silenced the crowded cafe, all eyes falling on Harriet as she confronted Christopher with unwavering courage. Never had a simple tap, tap, tap held so much power. It was the moment that changed everything. A rejected bride told she was too crippled to be worthwhile daring to stand her ground in a Wyoming frontier town. From that electrifying showdown grew a story of resilience and quiet strength, proving that sometimes the greatest battles are fought in the smallest, most personal ways. Before we dive deeper, please support our channel by subscribing right now. Your subscription helps us continue bringing you uplifting tales filled with hope, perseverance, and the enduring spirit of frontier life. Stick around and listen to the entire story to discover the unexpected alliance, the twists of fate, and how one woman's resolve overcame a world determined to underestimate her. Harriet Moore stared out the dusty train window, anxiety churning in her stomach as the engine screeched to a halt at Pine Creek Station. Outside, the sparse Wyoming landscape stretched in all directions, rolling plains tinged with autumn's ochre and russet, distant purple mountains that looked painted against the horizon. The conductor's booming announcement startled her from her daze. This was it. Pine Creek, the final stop before she was meant to travel by stage to High River Settlement. The letter in her reticule crinkled softly with every motion, her sole lifeline, a promise of a fresh start from a man she had never laid eyes on. His name was Christopher Langley, a rancher of moderate success, or so he'd written, seeking a mail-order bride. Harriet smoothed the front of her worn navy skirt self-consciously, adjusting the brace on her left leg so it would be less visible. She had told him many things in her letters about her education in a Boston women's college, her skill in arithmetic and literature, her love for reading Emerson, but never about the childhood illness that had left her permanently crippled. In her mind, Harriet was not lying so much as omitting. If Christopher truly cared for an intelligent, resourceful partner, perhaps he would see past the brace. She gathered her single valise from the overhead rack, rising to her feet with deliberate care. Each step felt like an announcement of her infirmity, the cane tapping in a steady but uneven rhythm. Even now, she could feel the sideways glances of fellow passengers. Some looked sympathetic. Others appeared relieved that it was not their burden to bear. Harriet ignored them all. This was her chance, her only chance, really, to build a life removed from the claustrophobic prejudices of Boston, where she had been dismissed from a teaching position. The moment a new headmaster decided a lame schoolmarm set a poor example for impressionable children. Stepping onto the station's modest wooden platform, Harriet inhaled the crisp western air. It smelled of sage and possibility. She spied a small knot of townspeople gathered near the depot, men in dust-stained hats, a few women in plain dresses. Her heart thumped in her chest, half hoping, half dreading to see Christopher, but no one emerged with a welcoming sign or even an outstretched hand. Clutching her cane and valise, Harriet asked a wide-eyed boy if Christopher Langley was about. The lad nodded, then pointed down the single street lined with clapboard storefronts. Langley was at the feed store earlier, the boy said, nibbling an apple. Should be round the cafe soon, heard he was meeting someone from the train. Harriet swallowed, thanked the child, and started forward with measured steps, ignoring the twinge of her leg. The main thoroughfare was little more than a wide, dirt-packed road with a half-dozen buildings on each side. A saloon, a hardware store, the feed store, a small church spire at the far end. As Harriet made her way along, she could not help noticing how her limp drew the eye of every passerby. She pressed forward, shoulders squared. There was no turning back. Finally, outside a plain-looking cafe, Harriet glimpsed a tall figure with close-cropped blonde hair and a well-trimmed mustache. He wore a fine coat that seemed out of place amid the rough clothing of the other men. Her pulse quickened. He matched the description from those letters exactly. Summoning her courage, she approached him, clearing her throat. "Mr. Christopher Langley," she ventured, voice trembling only slightly. He turned, studied her face, then let his gaze travel downward, pausing at her cane. Something like dismay flickered in his expression. "Miss Moore," he said, words laced with palpable hesitation. Harriet nodded, smiling as warmly as she could. "I've arrived, sir." As promised. For a heartbeat, they simply regarded each other until Christopher's eyes hardened. "You didn't mention this," he said, gesturing to her brace, "that you were—" He caught himself before finishing the word. Harriet's throat went dry. "I can manage most tasks," she replied quietly. "My condition doesn't prevent me from cooking or keeping accounts. I'm as capable as I ever was." But Christopher's face told a different story. In that instant, Harriet knew. All her hopes, her cross-country travel, her vulnerability, None of it mattered to him if she couldn't walk without a cane. Christopher's mouth formed a thin line. "Let's talk inside," he suggested, stepping toward the cafe. Harriet followed with forced dignity, ignoring the creeping sensation that half the town was already watching. Inside the cafe was modest wooden tables, a long counter, a few patrons sipping midday coffee. Christopher selected a table near the back. Harriet, gripping her cane, lowered herself into a chair, bracing for the blow she sensed was coming. He sat across from her, arms folded, gaze still fixed on her leg rather than her face, Miss Moore. He began, leaning in as though confiding a secret. "I realize you traveled a long way, but there's been a misunderstanding. I need a wife who can assist with ranch duties, especially as I expand my herd. A partner who can rope calves in a pinch or ride out to manage supplies. You never indicated in your letters that you had this limitation." Harriet's cheeks burned, though she fought for composure. She set her valise at her feet, resisting the urge to lash out. "I'm perfectly capable of many tasks, Mr. Langley. I've kept accounts, cooked for large groups, taught a classroom of restless children." She tried to keep her voice steady, recalling the many times she had been overlooked or dismissed back in Boston. "The ranch life is physically demanding." Christopher persisted, voice tight. "I was not prepared to accommodate such a condition. It's not personal. I simply need someone robust." As I explained in my advertisement, Harriet's throat constricted. She remembered that advertisement well. He'd asked for a partner of sound mind and warm heart who valued education. He'd never once specified a woman had to be physically perfect. Perhaps he had assumed, or perhaps Harriet had simply allowed herself to believe that detail wouldn't matter. Silence hung between them, the cafe's meager bustle seeming distant and unreal. Harriet felt eyes on her from the next table, from the man behind the counter, from the old woman sipping tea by the window. She could taste shame on her tongue as acrid as gall. "I see," she finally managed. "Then it seems I have no place here." Christopher hesitated, glancing around to ensure no one was eavesdropping. "I can refund your train ticket," he offered, "pay your fare home. But I can't proceed with an engagement that's doomed to fail." Harriet nodded, heart pounding as though it might burst. "What would you have me say, Mr. Langley? That I'm sorry for misleading you. I never claimed to be a champion, horsewoman, or a farm laborer." She willed herself not to cry. "I am who I am." He exhaled heavily, pressing a coin into the waitress's hand to cover their untouched coffee. "I'll ensure your lodging is covered for a night or two," he said as they rose. "But after that, it'd be best if you found somewhere else. I have my reputation to consider." That last line, uttered so coolly, made Harriet's blood run cold. It was not the first time she had been cast aside, but it stung more deeply because of everything she had risked. Within minutes, the confrontation ended. Christopher turned on his heel and departed, leaving Harriet alone, cane in hand, the entire cafe quietly buzzing with gossip. Harriet felt tears prick her eyes, but she forced herself upright, squaring her shoulders as she too walked out into the relentless Wyoming sunshine. She refused to crumble here. Outside, the main street was painfully bright, the dusty air swirling around her skirts. She had all of $17 to her name. No job, no references, in a town that would likely side with Christopher's version of events. She spotted a pair of men who had been in the cafe earlier, nudging each other as they watched her pass, with no lodging. Harriet had little choice but to move on, so she walked, limping cane in the dust, away from Pine Creek, away from the man who had promised a future, ignoring the silent or curious stares of strangers. She was alone in the worst way possible, determined not to break down in front of these judgmental townsfolk. The road stretched ahead, endless and unkind, the sky arching overhead like a silent witness. Harriet pressed on hour after hour until the sharp pang in her leg reminded her she'd overdone it. Then came the storm. Sudden and fierce black clouds devouring the horizon. By the time raindrops pelted her face, Harriet realized she had ventured far from any shelter. The wind howled, lightning split the sky, and she trudged forward, exhausted water seeping into her worn boots, the mud threatening to suck the cane from her grip. If there was a low point in her life, Harriet thought this might be it. When she finally spotted an isolated barn on a nearby rise, she mustered the last of her strength and limped toward it, heart hammering with desperation. The barn door creaked as Harriet forced it open, relief washing over her when she found it dry inside, though dim and full of shadows. Her left leg throbbed mercilessly, the brace chafing after the long wet trek. Outside, thunder reverberated, making the barn's rafters tremble. Harriet advanced gingerly, smelling damp hay and old leather, relieved that no one shouted for her to leave. She supposed the owners were either absent or holed up in a nearby house. All she needed was a corner to rest to wait out the storm. She sank onto a bale of hay, the cane clattering to the floor, tears finally spilling unbidden. Can't cry, she muttered to herself, wiping at her cheeks. This doesn't fix anything. Still the weight of everything, Boston's rejections, Christopher's callous dismissal, the unknown future pressed down like an anvil on her heart. Slumping against the coarse hay, Harriet closed her eyes, lulled by the drumming rain on the barn's roof and the muffled snorts of horses in nearby stalls. She was still damp and cold, but at least she was no longer in the storm's direct fury. Despite the adrenaline that had carried her this far, exhaustion soon claimed her. She woke sometime later to an unfamiliar voice. "Ma'am," it asked, sounding concerned. "Ma'am, are you all right?" startled out. Harriet blinked in the wavering light of a lantern. A tall man stood nearby, the glow illuminating shoulders thick with muscle under a worn flannel shirt, a lined face that spoke of both youth and hardship. His hair was dark, and a neatly trimmed beard framed firm features. Harriet's gaze fell to where his left pant leg ended below the knee in a wooden prosthetic. He was, in short, a man who knew something of adversity. I'm sorry," Harriet stammered, forcing herself upright. "I didn't mean to trespass. The storm caught me on the road." The man observed her with neither scorn nor pity, just frank assessment. "Name's Gideon Price," he offered lantern, illuminating his kind but cautious expression. "This is my place. You're welcome to stay until the rain passes." Harriet exhaled relief. After a day of humiliation, she had expected to be thrown out. Instead, Gideon's words carried an unexpected gentleness. "Thank you," she managed. "I'm Harriet Moore. I was out of options." In the flickering lantern light, Gideon noticed her cane, her soaked clothes. "You from Pine Creek? Did not figure anyone would be traveling in this weather." Harriet swallowed hard. "I arrived today by train, expecting to stay." That fell through. She didn't elaborate. Uncertain how much to reveal to the stranger, Gideon offered his hand to help her up. She rose unsteadily, accepting his steadying support. "House is up yonder," he said, jerking his chin toward the barn door. "Better shelter than this. Storm's dying down, but you are cold and half soaked. I can make you coffee, find you something dry." Harriet hesitated. She had nowhere else to go. Yes, but stepping into a stranger's household carried its own risks. Gideon sensed her pause. "Just shelter," he clarified. Voice firm, but without offense. "Food a bed for tonight. Nothing more complicated, can't leave you to freeze out here." The sincerity in his tone, plus the obvious signs of his own hardships, convinced Harriet to trust him. "Thank you," she whispered. I appreciate your kindness." They emerged from the barn into a world transformed. Rain still dripped from the roof, the clouds parting enough to reveal a slice of moonlit sky. Harriet clutched her cane, matching Gideon's uneven steps. He moved adeptly despite his wooden leg, a testament to the resilience such a life must demand. Reaching the modest farmhouse, Harriet noted the golden glow from a single-lit window. Entering, she felt immediate warmth from a low fire and a stone hearth. "The space tidy, but plainly furnished," said Gideon instructed, nodding to a wooden chair near the fire. "Let me grab dry clothes. My sister left some things behind. You could wear." Harriet, though exhausted, managed a polite nod. She watched him limp down a short hallway, feeling both curiosity and relief at his unhesitating generosity. Gideon returned moments later with a cotton nightgown and a simple wool robe, explaining that his sister Sophia had stayed with him last year, leaving behind extra garments. Harriet accepted them, mustering a grateful smile. "I'll pay you back somehow," she offered, voice cracking from fatigue. Gideon shook his head. "Let's not talk debts now." "Change then. Come, have stew. I've got a pot that needs finishing." Harriet's eyes flickered with gratitude. She hadn't tasted a hot meal all day, and the notion of stew set her stomach rumbling. He showed her to a small, spare bedroom. It was a humble space with a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, and a single crocheted blanket over a patchwork quilt. The washstand had a chipped basin filled with fresh water. "Take your time," Gideon said gently. "Knock if you need anything." Then he closed the door. For a moment, Harriet just stood there, absorbing this unexpected warmth after her day of rejection. Setting aside her chain, she peeled off her damp dress, carefully removing the steel and leather brace, wincing at how the straps had chafed her skin. She washed quickly at the basin, relishing the sensation of clean, warm water on her face and arms. The borrowed nightgown was a bit loose around the shoulders, but the robe enveloped her in a snug, comforting warmth. When she finally emerged, Harriet found Gideon in the main room, ladling stew into two wooden bowls. He had removed his boots, an outer shirt wearing only trousers and a rumpled undershirt. She now saw his prosthetic. More clearly, a carved wooden extension strapped at the knee. Her heart twisted in sympathy, recalling how her own leg brace often rubbed sores. "Please sit," Gideon said, placing a steaming bowl on the table. Harriet settled into a sturdy chair, somewhat self-conscious in the borrowed robe, but Gideon's attention remained on serving the food. He set a bowl before her along with a hunk of bread and a tin cup of coffee. "I wasn't sure if you take sugar," he offered, motioning to a small sugar bowl. Harriet's throat constricted with emotion. Such an ordinary courtesy, yet after the day's cruelty, it felt monumental. Her first spoonful of stew nearly brought tears. It was hearty with chunks of beef, potato, and carrots simmered in a thick gravy, its aroma filling the small house. "It's wonderful," she murmured, taking a sip of coffee. Gideon watched her with mild relief. "Good, wasn't sure how hungry you'd be. You looked half dead when I found you." Harriet reddened, but not from shame. She appreciated his honesty. "I felt half dead," she admitted. "That storm would have done me in if I hadn't found your barn." A lengthy silence followed as they ate, Harriet content to enjoy the stew and the calming presence of the man who had rescued her from a miserable fate. After dinner, Gideon showed her a bit more of the house. It was plain but efficient, an open main room with a fireplace, a small kitchen area, and a single hallway leading to a couple of bedrooms plus the spare room. Little decorative frills, few personal touches. Harriet surmised Gideon lived alone, likely doing the bulk of chores himself. "Used to have a hired man, but let him go when finances got tight." Gideon explained, "I manage with part-time help from a neighbor named Will, who comes by for heavier tasks. The land's decent, but the water's always uncertain." His voice carried a subdued note hinting at underlying challenges. Harriet recalled her conversation with Christopher, who had boasted about his cattle empire. Gideon's place felt more modest, more genuine. Taking cups of coffee to the small hearth, Gideon invited Harriet to sit in the single rocker near the fire. He perched on a nearby stool, wooden leg angled awkwardly. So he began, voice soft in the flickering firelight. "You came here expecting a fiancé, only to find yourself cast out. Mind if I ask who?" Harriet swallowed, remembering the humiliating scene in the cafe. "Christopher Langley. He wrote me letters for half a year promising partnership, then refused to proceed once he saw my disability." She tapped the cane propped against the wall. Bitterness creeping into her tone. Gideon's features hardened. "Langley. I've heard of him, though. I've never had cause to deal with him directly. Wealthy cunning, likes to throw his weight around in Pine Creek." Harriet nodded, brow furrowing. His rejection was public. He made sure everyone saw. I was too stunned to argue, so I left. Gideon studied her. "I'm guessing you told no one about your brace, figuring it wouldn't matter if the rest of you matched his preferences." A wry smile tugged Harriet's lips, though sadness edged her eyes. "Naive of me. I hope my education and capabilities mattered more than my limp." The words hung in the warm air, bearing a lifetime of disappointment. Thus began Harriet's first days at Gideon's farm, a tentative arrangement shaped by practicality and overshadowed by the humiliations of her arrival. She insisted on performing tasks to earn her keep, from sweeping floors to washing dishes and tidying cupboards that had clearly been neglected in a bachelor's household. Gideon accepted her help with a mixture of gratitude and mild embarrassment, as though uncertain how to reconcile his desire for independence with Harriet's capable presence. Each passing day they slipped into a semblance of routine. Harriet woke early to stoke the fire and begin breakfast. Gideon handled outside chores, tending to the vegetable plots, mending fences, caring for a few horses and a pair of goats. On the second afternoon, Harriet was dusting the front room when the door banged open and a formidable woman strode in without waiting for an invitation. Harriet nearly dropped her rag in surprise. The woman, perhaps in her mid-40s, was stout and wore her iron gray hair in a tight bun. She regarded Harriet with open suspicion. "Where's Gideon?" she demanded, arms folded beneath a sturdy bosom. Harriet answered politely, "He's at the far field with the goats. May I help you?" A snort followed. "Name's Mrs. Haverford. I do washing and occasional cooking for Gideon. Heard he took in a straggler from Pine Creek." "So it's true." Her gaze zeroed in on Harriet's brace. Offering a calm smile, Harriet introduced herself. "Harriet Moore, Mr. Price kindly offered me a place until I decide my next steps." Mrs. Haverford's lips pursed. "I see. And I suppose you've learned all about his situation." Harriet felt a wave of uncertainty. If you're referring to difficulties with the ranch, Gideon's mentioned water issues but not much else. The older woman squinted, scanning Harriet's plain attire and unwavering posture. So you don't know about the property dispute with a Christopher Langley, do you? Or how some folks side with a Langley because he's on the town council? Or how rumors swirl about Gideon's past in the war? Harriet's throat tightened. She mustered a direct response. I know Gideon Price has treated me with more compassion than anyone else since I arrived in Wyoming, which is enough to earn my respect. A pause, then a curt nod from Mrs. Haverford. You've got spirit. But if you mean to stay, be aware that Langley won't like it. He's never liked Gideon. The farmland next door used to belong to a man named Clark, who willed it to Gideon instead of selling to Langley. Since then, Langley's tried every trick to wrest it away. He'll use any leverage, financial, political, even personal. Harriet swallowed. It echoed what she'd gleaned from Gideon in bits and pieces. Thank you for the warning, Mrs. Haverford, she said quietly. The older woman grunted in acknowledgement. I'll be riding along. Just had to see for myself. What manner of woman Gideon's taken in. Don't prove me right about the worst. Then she left as swiftly as she'd come. Harriet exhaled, sinking onto a stool. So Gideon had enemies, or at least one enemy, with wealth and influence. She recalled the name Christopher Langley with a pang, realizing that the man who had so cruelly dismissed her was the same who threatened Gideon's livelihood. Harriet felt a surge of protectiveness, though she hardly knew Gideon. Sensing the need to contribute more, Harriet redoubled her efforts, not just cleaning, but also sorting Gideon's neglected finances. She discovered bills for feed receipts for equipment, all jumbled in a desk drawer. She diligently sorted them, creating a simple ledger to track expenditures and incoming farm income. When Gideon returned that evening, Harriet showed him the newly organized ledger. He looked genuinely relieved, even impressed. You've saved me hours of headache, he admitted, scanning the neat columns. Harriet suppressed a smile, gratified to be useful. I was a teacher, after all. She teased gently. Numbers are second nature. Gideon's eyes warmed, though a hint of sadness lingered. For a man who came back from the war, missing half a leg, some things feel harder. I appreciate the help. She noted how he rarely spoke about the war directly, and she resolved not to pry, respecting his unspoken boundaries. On the fourth day, Harriet was hanging freshly laundered clothes on the line behind the house when Gideon approached, brow creased with tension. We have company, he said quietly, nodding toward a small plume of dust on the horizon. Harriet's stomach flipped. Sure enough, half an hour later, Christopher Langley rode up, flanked by 3 men and the young sheriff, a man Harriet vaguely recognized from Pine Creek. She steeled herself, recalling the humiliating moment he'd dismissed her in that cafe. Gideon stepped out to meet them, rifle resting casually in the crook of his arm. Though Harriet could tell he was coiled with tension, Christopher dismounted, sweeping a haughty glance around the modest yard. Price, he greeted, removing his hat. I've come to see about the arrangement you've established here. Gideon's jaw tightened. My business is none of yours, Langley, unless you've got a legal cause to be here. Christopher's gaze shifted to Harriet as she stepped onto the porch. He gave a mocking half-smile. Miss Moore, surprised to see you still about. I assumed you'd realize this setup wasn't tenable. Harriet squared her shoulders, gripping her cane. Mr. Price has been more than fair, unlike some. The jab didn't go unnoticed. One of Christopher's men snickered. Another spat on the ground. The young sheriff cleared his throat, trying to stand taller. Now, Mr. Langley is concerned about Miss Moore's welfare, as she might be in a precarious situation living here. Unchaperoned, Gideon retorted. She's employed. I'm hardly forcing her to stay. Harriet's heart pounded, but she stepped forward, chin raised. I'm not in need of Christopher Langley's concern, or anyone else's for that matter. Christopher smirked, tipping his hat in mocking deference. So spirited. Yet rumor has it Gideon's precarious finances might not stand another season. Are you certain you wish to tie your fate to his? There's no future in a failing farm. Harriet refused to waver under his sneer. I prefer my own judgment about who is worth standing by. With a swift, almost theatrical move, Christopher turned to the sheriff. You see, the woman's made her bed. We can't force her to leave, can we? The sheriff's discomfort was evident, but he mumbled, No, sir, not unless there's evidence of wrongdoing. Christopher nodded, a thin smile curling his lips. Just keep an eye, Sheriff. The council meets soon, and improper conduct could weigh heavily in some decisions, especially regarding water rights. His gaze flicked to Gideon. We wouldn't want scandal. Gideon's knuckles whitened on his rifle, but he held himself in check. You've delivered your threat. Now go. The standoff ended as abruptly as it began. Christopher mounted his horse, his men following. They rode off in a swirl of dust, leaving Harriet breathless, Gideon fuming. She could sense the adrenaline crackling in the air. After a moment, Gideon sighed, lowering his rifle. Harriet placed a steadying hand on his arm. "It's all right," she said softly, though she wasn't sure it was. "He's trying to intimidate us." Gideon glanced at her with haunted eyes. "Christopher's done more than threaten. He's fought me in court over inherited land, pressured townspeople to boycott my produce, spread rumors about me controlling my sister's finances. He won't stop." Harriet heard the faint tremor in his voice and realized this was deeper than just a neighborly feud. She thought about how many doors had shut in her face simply because she wasn't physically perfect. Gideon had endured closed doors too, for different reasons. Maybe his injury, maybe jealousy from men like Christopher. Harriet squeezed his arm gently. "We stand firm," she said, echoing Emerson's words. Gideon had read to her the previous evening. "You told me once not to run from problems. That goes for you too." For a moment, the tension in Gideon's posture eased, replaced by gratitude. "Thank you," he murmured. "I won't let him drive you away." Harriet felt an unexpected warmth at the conviction in his tone. Was it possible that in this short time they had become more to each other than mere acquaintances? The idea both thrilled and frightened her. 2 days later, Harriet was ladling water into a trough outside the barn when a horse-drawn carriage clattered up the lane, revealing a slender woman with dark hair pinned in an elegant twist. Sophia Price, Gideon's younger sister. Harriet knew the name only from Gideon's offhand remarks, that Sophia had once lived here, then left under murky circumstances. She tried to quell her nerves, recalling Gideon's mention that Sophia was spirited, quick-witted, and fiercely protective of her brother. Harriet set the bucket down, wiping her brow as the carriage stopped. Sophia climbed out with brisk efficiency, wearing a traveling cloak far too refined for such a dusty yard. She glanced around appraisingly, then caught sight of Harriet. For a moment, Harriet felt pinned by the woman's discerning gaze, similar to Gideon's brown eyes, yet sharper somehow, as if looking for hidden motives. Harriet mustered a polite smile. "Welcome back, Miss Price. Gideon mentioned you might be arriving." Sophia inclined her head. "Yes, I'm a bit early. Couldn't wait once I heard about Christopher's latest schemes." Her words were direct, carrying no trace of small-town coyness. "You must be Harriet Moore, the housekeeper Gideon hired." Harriet flushed at the incomplete label. "I'm helping with the farm." "And household?" "Yes. Gideon's been kind enough to give me room and board." A flicker of amusement crossed Sophia's features. That's one way to put it. Before Harriet could inquire further, Gideon strode out of the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. His face lit with surprise. "Sophia, wasn't expecting you till next week." She shrugged. "Situation's urgent. Couldn't stay in Denver another day, Judge Franklin told me. Christopher's moving faster than we thought." Harriet watched as the siblings embraced tension visible in Gideon's posture. "We'll talk inside," he said. "Harriet, could you?" Harriet nodded. "I'll bring in tea or coffee." "Which would you prefer, Miss Price?" Sophia studied her a moment, as if not used to being asked about her preferences. "Coffee, if you have it." Harriet offered a brisk nod and carried the water bucket toward the well. Inside, after removing her cloak, Sophia perched at the kitchen table. Gideon leaned against the doorway, arms folded. Harriet set a pot of coffee on to brew, silently preparing cups. From the corner of her eye, she noticed Sophia scanning the meticulously cleaned surfaces. The reorganized shelves, the fresh flowers Harriet had placed in a small vase. "This house looks different," Sophia murmured. "Feels different, too." Gideon shared a glance with Harriet, then addressed his sister. "Harriet's done a lot in a short time. She's made it home again." Harriet blushed, turning to busy herself with the coffee. Sophia's lips curved in a slight smile, though tension lined her forehead. "So you wrote that Christopher is trying to get a new judge to overturn the Chapman will," Gideon prompted. Sophia nodded gravely, withdrawing papers from her traveling case. Harriet placed steaming cups of coffee before them, then took a seat, listening as Sophia explained how Christopher had courted officials to cast doubt on the old man's testament. "He's claiming you manipulated Chapman, Gideon, that you withheld help or threatened to withdraw care unless the will was changed." Gideon's expression grew stormy. "Pure slander." Harriet bristled, remembering how Christopher had so casually attempted to buy her off. His capacity for manipulation was boundless. Sophia continued. "Worst part is that Christopher has a new witness, a local land surveyor who claims to have overheard Chapman complaining about your pressure tactics. Gideon, if that testimony is accepted, it could ruin your claim to the property." Harriet felt a pang of concern. She had seen how crucial water rights were to the farm. If Gideon lost access, everything might collapse. Is there no defense? She asked softly. Hands clasped in her lap, Sophia exhaled. I've gathered sworn statements from Judge Simmons and others who knew Chapman well, but it may not outweigh the new judge's conservative stance. Rumor is Christopher already bribed certain officials. Silence descended, broken only by the ticking of the clock. Harriet inhaled, mustering courage. Then we must plan a counter. Gideon's done nothing wrong. The farm is well run. The will was valid. There has to be a way. Sophia's gaze shifted to her brother, then back to Harriet. There might be. She paused, lips pursed, but it requires removing any question of impropriety from the equation. Harriet stiffened. Realizing where this was headed, Gideon cut in Sophia enough. You're not suggesting that, again. Harriet's heart thudded. Suggesting what she asked, though she suspected she knew. Sophia leaned forward. A marriage of convenience. If Harriet remains here unmarried, Christopher can smear her presence. Claim moral impropriety. But if Harriet and Gideon were married, that angle vanishes. The court sees a respectable household, a couple with legitimate cause to share property. Harriet's stomach flipped, recalling the faint flickers of attraction she felt, as well as the complexities of forging such a bond from mere necessity. She hesitated. Searching Gideon's face, in the hush, the only sound was the final drips of coffee into the pot. Later that evening, Harriet found herself alone in the main room, gazing into the dying embers of the fireplace. Sophia and Gideon had retreated to separate corners of the house, presumably to consider the implications of the day's discussion. Harriet's mind churned. The notion of marrying Gideon for convenience made her blush. In equal parts, shame and possibility. She could not deny the quiet companionship they had built, nor the unexpected spark that flared whenever they stood too close or exchanged heartfelt confidences. But was that enough to bind their fates legally and forever? And would Gideon truly benefit from such a union? Or would Christopher's power plays escalate? The door clicked open. Gideon limped in, hair slightly damp from washing, looking as though he'd been turning the same questions over in his mind. He offered Harriet a faint smile. Couldn't sleep? He asked, settling into the chair beside hers. Harriet shook her head. Too many thoughts. She paused. Gideon, about Sophia's proposal. Do you find it as unthinkable as you seemed earlier? He rubbed a hand over his face, sighing. It's not unthinkable. It's complicated. I want you to stay. He halted as though uncertain how much of his emotion to reveal. Harriet felt her pulse quicken. I want to stay, she whispered, voice trembling slightly. Not because of the property or out of fear. Because I feel safe here with you. Gideon's gaze flickered over her, that warmth she had come to cherish, shining in his eyes. Then we share the same feelings. He hesitated, adjusting the pant leg over his wooden prosthetic. I spent a year letting people's opinions guide me, Harriet. After the war, I worried about how folks perceived a crippled rancher. For a time, I tried to prove I was as able-bodied as anyone else. But it cost me my health, my peace of mind. Harriet swallowed, understanding too well the exhaustion of constantly fighting society's judgments. You don't have to prove anything to me. Her voice came out gentle yet firm. I see your worth, Gideon, price, wooden leg, and all. I only wonder if tying yourself to me, a woman with a cane who arrived with a worthless betrothal arrangement, burdens you further. He shook his head, reaching out to take her hand, his touch comforting. If anything, you've lightened my load since you walked through that barn door. I'm trying to protect you from Christopher's manipulations, not push you away. A hush fell, the flickering embers casting shadows that danced across their faces. Harriet laced her fingers through his, deciding it was time for honesty. You said you want me to stay. I do too, but a marriage of convenience might become a wedge between us if we see it only as a tactic. I'd need to know that you care for me truly rather than just using me to silence rumors. A faint blush colored his cheeks. Harriet, I care more deeply than I ever thought I could in such a short span. You're strong, compassionate, clever. My household no longer feels empty. My days no longer feel lonely. Harriet inhaled sharply, tears threatening. I feel the same. Her voice trembled, but she pressed on. I can't imagine leaving you behind. Gideon's expression lit with tentative hope, as though each word hammered away at an invisible wall. He lifted her hand, brushing his lips against her knuckles. Then let's consider this carefully with our hearts, not just strategy. If we join our lives, it's because we see a future worth nurturing. Christopher's plots be damned. Harriet's cheeks flushed, her heart fluttering. She dared not speak for fear that any response might be insufficient. Instead, she offered him a smile that she hoped conveyed her answer. In the quiet hush of night with the embers flickering low, they stayed close, saying little more. Outside the wind rustled the eaves, a gentle hush that felt like a lullaby. Harriet closed her eyes, leaning her head on Gideon's shoulder. That single, simple gesture said everything. She was here, she was safe, and they were together in a way no manipulations from Christopher could sever. And in that small pocket of peace, Harriet dared believe in the promise of a life. They might forge one shaped by mutual respect, quiet affection, and the resilience only hardship can teach. Morning arrived with a sense of hushed anticipation, as though the farmland itself braced for whatever might unfold. Sophia had left at first light to speak with Judge Simmons once more, hoping to expedite her evidence against Christopher Gideon. Busied himself outside checking fences and seeing to the livestock. Harriet, girded by the new understanding, blossoming between them, set to work with renewed purpose. She tidied the house, prepared fresh biscuits, and sorted more receipts in the ledger. Their shared life felt strangely harmonious, each step forward balanced by a sense of deeper emotional footing. In mid-morning, Harriet ventured outside with a basket of laundry to hang on the line. She paused to admire the wide, cloud-dotted sky, inhaling the fresh tang of pine. This land was growing dear to her, each sunrise reaffirming that it could become a lasting home. As she pinned a sheet, Gideon appeared, boots scuffing the dirt. "We need to talk," he said, voice threaded with tension. Harriet's heart lurched. "Did something happen?" He exhaled. "Will, my part-time farmhand, just rode in from Pine Creek. Word is Christopher's ramped up allegations about the Chapman property. He's not waiting for the new judge to arrive. He's pressuring the town council for an immediate meeting." Harriet set aside the laundry, mind racing. That must be why Sophia hurried out. She suspected he'd accelerate his plans. They retreated inside for privacy. Gideon paced the main room, occasionally glancing at Harriet with conflicted eyes. "The council can't revoke my right to the land outright, but they can make recommendations that sway the judge's decision. If they cast doubt on my moral standing, accuse me of harboring an unmarried woman under questionable circumstances," Christopher might argue, "I lack the character to hold property." Harriet inhaled, remembering how such moral judgments had cost her teaching job in Boston. So many times the story was the same, those in power using vague moral codes to penalize the vulnerable. "What can we do if we show up to this meeting and they see me? It might fuel the rumors," she said. Gideon shook his head, determination lighting his face. "No, I won't hide you. That's exactly the kind of intimidation Christopher thrives on. If we run from it, we give him free rein to slander us." Harriet's eyes flickered with admiration. "Then we stand firm. But standing firm might be easier if we quell the rumor that I'm just your kept woman." She felt a rush of heat at her own candor, but pressed on. "If we mean what we said about building a life, maybe it's time we do something about it publicly." Gideon still turning to face her fully. "Harriet, are you sure? A quick marriage under these circumstances could feel forced, but if your heart is in it," Harriet stepped forward, resting her cane aside so she could place a hand over his. "My heart is in it, Gideon. Our reasons might have begun with necessity, but the feelings we share now go deeper. And if marrying helps preserve your land and my dignity, why wait?" For a long moment, Gideon searched her gaze, and Harriet had never felt more vulnerable or resolute. Then his tension melted, replaced by a gentle conviction. "We'll do it properly," he said. "Judge Simmons can oversee it before he retires." And with Sophia as a witness, Harriet smiled, relief coursing through her. "I'm not wearing my borrowed nightgown, though," she quipped, trying to lighten the seriousness. Gideon chuckled, his shoulders finally relaxing. "No, we'll find you something fitting. We'll do it right, no matter how quickly we can do it with care." They decided the ceremony would take place in Judge Simmons's makeshift chambers above the general store, a quiet, hasty arrangement, but no less valid. Sophia returned that evening with encouraging news. Her collected evidence had caused a stir. The old judge was prepared to sign an affidavit supporting Gideon's claim, and she believed Christopher was on the verge of facing serious accusations of fraud. "Perfect timing for a wedding," Sophia declared, her tone wry, but her eyes twinkling with genuine relief. Harriet spent the next few days preparing quietly. She used a bolt of fabric Sophia had brought from Denver, stitching a simple ivory dress. It wasn't the elaborate wedding Harriet might have once imagined, but it carried her hopes and pride in equal measure. Gideon scoured the farm for wildflowers she could hold, eventually returning with an armful of pale autumn blooms. Harriet arranged them into a small bouquet, touched by his thoughtfulness. On the appointed morning, Harriet rose early. Outside, a crisp breeze rustled the last golden leaves clinging to the trees. Her leg twinged as she dressed, but she paid it no mind. Today was about forging her own destiny. She pinned back her hair, checking her reflection in a small mirror. The brace beneath her gown was visible if one looked closely, but Harriet felt no shame. This was who she was, and Gideon had accepted that wholeheartedly. The short ride into Pine Creek was surreal. Harriet, clad in the homemade ivory dress, Gideon in a freshly laundered shirt and a borrowed suit coat from his father's old trunk. Townsfolk peered from windows, stepping out onto porches as their wagon passed. Harriet spotted a few thin-lipped stares, but also a surprising number of kind nods. Word had spread that Christopher's schemes were collapsing. Perhaps public sentiment had turned. They arrived at the general store, ascending the narrow stairs to the second-floor office inside Judge Simmons greeted them with a gentle smile. He looked tired, lines of age etched into his face, but he rose to shake Gideon's hand and kiss Harriet's cheek. "I've seen many cases in my time," he said, voice raspy with emotion. "Not often do I see a couple come together under such adversity." "My congratulations," Harriet thanked him softly, her stomach fluttering. Sophia stood beside her, pressing Harriet's hand in silent encouragement. Will, the part-time farmhand, hovered near Gideon, shifting from foot to foot in awkward pride. Judge Simmons cleared his throat. "Let's proceed," he said, producing a worn leather-bound ledger from a nearby shelf. His official seal and a battered quill pen lay on the table. The few onlookers formed a small semicircle. Harriet could hardly hear over the pounding of her own heart. Gideon took her hands in, his voice trembling only slightly as he recited the vows they had shaped to reflect their uncommon beginnings. "I, Gideon Price, take you, Harriet Moore, to be my companion in work and in life, to stand firm with you through every challenge the frontier can bring, to share my home, my name, and my hopes for the future." Harriet blinked back tears, the moment so profound she could scarcely breathe. She repeated her vows in turn, promising respect, partnership, and an abiding willingness to face any storm together. They exchanged simple rings. Gideon had found a plain silver band for her, while Harriet had chosen a thicker band of engraved brass for him, a nod to the metal that had once symbolized her brace, yet now stood for resilience. When they signed the official register, Harriet's hand shook slightly, but her signature gleamed with unwavering commitment. "By the authority vested in me," Judge Simmons intoned, "I now pronounce you husband and wife." Gideon lifted Harriet's veil, the simplest scrap of lace she had pinned in place, and kissed her with a tenderness that caused hush among the small gathering. For Harriet, time seemed to crystallize in that gentle, reverent kiss. Every rejection and every sorrow of her past found resolution. She was not broken or unwanted. She was Harriet Price, bride and partner to a man who saw her for all she was. They stepped onto the street as a married couple, a few well-wishers clapping politely. Through the corner of her eye, Harriet noticed Christopher's men skulking near the livery stable, glaring uncertainly. She wondered what Christopher would say if he witnessed this union. Perhaps he'd be outraged that Harriet had claimed a better future despite his efforts to cast her aside. She felt no malice, only calm triumph. In a single act of faith, she and Gideon had claimed their own destiny, forging a bond that no rumor or threat could easily sever. When they returned to the farm, Harriet couldn't contain her tears, though these were tears of joy, of relief, of gratitude. She held Gideon's hand at the threshold of the farmhouse. "Home," she whispered. "We're home," and indeed they were. Months later, Christopher would be formally charged with fraud, his influence waning faster than winter snow. The property claims he had lodged against Gideon collapsed under the new evidence Sophia provided, and the town council begrudgingly recognized the Price farm's rightful water access. Harriet settled into her role with confidence, tending the garden, teaching a few local children in an improvised class for extra income, and finding daily peace in Gideon's steadfast partnership. No longer Harriet Moore, the crippled outsider she was, Harriet Price, an equal on a farm that thrived under their combined care, and in the evenings they would sit by the hearth reading poetry or simply talking about the future. Their hands intertwined in a land that prized rugged strength. Harriet discovered that true resilience arose not just from the body, but from the unwavering spirit of two souls who refused to surrender even, or especially when the world thought them broken. In the end, it wasn't about how they walked or which papers they held. It was about what they built. Harriet and Gideon discovered that true partnership grows from honest effort, shared dreams, and small daily acts of kindness. Their challenges didn't vanish overnight. Christopher still schemed, and frontier life remained unforgiving. But each morning, Harriet rose to the promise of a land that tested her resolve and rewarded her spirit. Together, she and Gideon carved out a future shaped by persistence, respect, and a gentle affection that deepened with every harvest and every hurdle overcome. When people speak of Harriet, now they don't dwell on her cane or her past rejections. They talk instead of a woman who refused to bend before others' judgments, who found hope and belonging in an unexpected place. May her journey remind us all that real strength springs from unity and that the bravest hearts can thrive even in the harshest terrain. Feel free to share your thoughts or experiences below, and let's discuss the enduring power of resilience.